All right, today we'll be talking about Chapter 6 from the AMSCO APUSH book, The Constitution and New Republic, 1787 to 1800. Like normal, I'll be taking notes on my own, off on the side, and so, like always, I definitely recommend that you take your own notes from what I'm taking. First half of the class is going to be a review of the Constitution, Constitutional Convention, a lot of what we talked about recently in class, and then talking about George Washington and John Adams, the first two presidents. Without further ado. The Articles of Confederation was the first set of laws, the first constitution written in America after the American Revolution. And the US was struggling to rule as an independent nation. They didn't always adhere to the Treaty of Paris, the peace treaty. Loyalists were sometimes stripped of their property, although the Treaty of Paris said that property was supposed to be returned to them or respected. And then just generally, the US struggled to repay debts to foreign powers, especially to France. The first constitution that they wrote was called the Articles of Confederation. And it mostly focused on strong state governments. It says there you had 13 states, and every state had their own currency. Every state had their own taxation, their own laws. And so what it led to was strong state governments who would be in competition with one another. They would place tariffs on each other. The federal government or the central government was actually quite weak under the Articles of Confederation. They weren't able to levy taxes or raise or collect taxes, among other weaknesses. Now, this was on purpose because after being ruled by King George III in England, they didn't want a strong monarch or central government. So they created a weak central government on purpose, but it definitely backfired. And Shays' Rebellion in 1787 kind of cast a spotlight on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Shays was a farmer who basically was upset about some of the high taxes he thought he was paying. And so he and his militia friends basically took over a region, stopped collection of taxes, and the recent US government was unable to collect taxes. So Shays' Rebellion kind of cast a spotlight on the weakness of the federal government, their inability to enforce their laws or collect taxes. And so, as we start off our notes here, we got to start off with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So there was a weak federal government, and there was an inability to collect taxes, especially, I'll say, after Shays' Rebellion. Again, that was on purpose. That was by design because they had just struggled against King George III and his unfair taxes. But a lot of American colonists realized, well, maybe we got to do more than what we have. So the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia in order to draft or write the Constitution. There were 55 delegates sent there from every single state except for Rhode Island. And all of these representatives were white, male, college-educated, and wealthy. Many of them were slave owners as well. This meeting was done in secret because of not wanting to tip off any of their foreign enemies or allies of what they were up to. And it was headed by George Washington, who was the commander of the colonial army during the French and Indian War and will become our first president. A lot of the famous names, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, are kind of the most famous founding fathers. But you can see some other famous members of the American Revolution were actually abroad. Thomas Jefferson was abroad, John Adams, Thomas Paine were abroad. Some others, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, who helped write the Declaration of Independence, wasn't chosen as a delegate. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, kind of the core group of authors. The Constitution basically establishes the framework for the US government. So I'm going to add some of the key details over here. It was ratified in 1787. So there are three branches. This was Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers. There is the legislative branch, that is the Senate and the House of Reps. We'll dig into how they do representation there. There's the executive branch, which is the president. And then there's the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. Now you can see here within the legislative branch, their purpose is to create laws. Let's actually add that real quick. Senate and House of Reps, slightly different rules on how those people are elected. The executive branch, their job is to enforce laws. And then the judicial branch, their job is to decide if laws are constitutional. Something called judicial review that we'll explore much more later on. So Senate, every state gets 2. They were originally appointed by state legislatures. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment in 1913 that they were directly elected through the popular vote. And they have a 6-year term, quite a long time. The House of Reps, they're more popular. They are elected by the people, popularly elected, and they only had to be 25. And representation was done by population there. So larger states like New York, let's say, would have more representatives. The president served 4-year terms. Back then, there was no term limit. It wasn't until after FDR when they set a term limit. You had to be 35 and you had to be a natural born citizen. So if you were born somewhere else, you could not be president. And then the president was allowed to have a cabinet, basically a board of advisors. Back then, he had a Secretary of State, Treasury and War. There are all sorts of more cabinet positions today. And then the Supreme Court. The Constitution gave the president the power to appoint a Supreme Court justice and the Senate the power to confirm those positions. Right now, there are nine Supreme Court justices. If you are watching this in 2021 or 2022, there might be 11 justices because the Democrats are considering increasing the number. Because the Constitution doesn't say. The Constitution simply says the president may appoint, the Senate may confirm these lifetime positions. Okay, now digging into some of the key compromises of the Constitution and Constitutional Convention. The first one is what's called the Great Compromise, and it had to do with representation. There was a dispute over whether representation should be based on population, which would give larger states more power, or whether representation should be based on equality of every state has an equal number. The Great Compromise creates both. It creates a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. The House is by population, and the Senate is 2 per state. That was designed to try to acknowledge both the demands of the smaller states, like a Rhode Island perhaps, and the larger states, like a New York, Massachusetts, Virginia, something like that. That's going to lead to some problems later on, but that's what they decided. The 3/5 compromise also said that enslaved Africans would count as 3/5 in terms of counting the population for representation. And quite ironically, actually, the South actually wanted them to be counted as a full person because, well, the South had enslaved Africans. So if they're counted as a full person, their population's bigger, they get more representatives. The North, who was oftentimes more anti-slavery, the North actually said, well, no, these enslaved Africans should not count. And so the 3/5 compromise is interesting because to us today, we oftentimes look at it and think like, you know, they saw these enslaved Africans as less than human, as 3/5 of a human, which is perhaps a fair point. But back then, it was more an argument about power. The South actually said they should count as full. The North said they shouldn't count, which is quite ironic considering how each region sometimes felt about slavery. The actual Constitution itself kind of kicked the can down the road on slavery. They did ban the slave trade to be in effect 20 years later in 1808. But the internal slave trade within the US was still allowed. So they kind of avoided the conversation of slavery because it was too controversial, and the North needed the South's approval to pass the Constitution. So they couldn't make it too controversial. And then one of the other key issues of the Constitution is taxation. The textbook calls this the Commerce Compromise. Remember, the big weakness of the Articles of Confederation is that they couldn't raise taxes. And so this now says Congress, the federal government, can regulate interstate commerce, interstate commerce and tariffs. And so that's going to allow the federal government to regulate trade and raise money through that. But Congress cannot place taxes on exports. An export is when you sell something from the US to somewhere else. And the South was afraid. The South was afraid that if the federal government had the ability to tax exports, then the South wouldn't be able to make money because their stuff would be too expensive. So you can already see kind of this North versus South division. There's also, through the Great Compromise, there's this dispute between large states and small states. Trying to get all of these states together with different needs and different environments, trying to get them to agree on one constitution, led to quite a few compromises. And then finally, the presidency. I'm going to put this as a compromise, although I don't know if it perfectly fits there. There was a lot of debate as to whether kings should have, whether presidents should have should serve for life like a king would, or if they should serve for shorter terms because they just got rid of a king. So what they ended up with was 4-year terms, no limits. George Washington would set the precedent of stepping down after 2 terms, but that wasn't actually a law until after FDR in the 1950s. But the one big compromise, I guess, of the president is that the president is not elected by the popular vote. Instead, they're elected by the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, again, is basically indirectly, the people vote for a representative who then votes for the president. Even to this day, we indirectly elect our president. And this was designed to weaken the power of the mobs and kind of guarantee a president that would protect the interests of the powerful, wealthy, propertied. Also a lot of debate about what powers to give the president. We talked in class this week about how the president has the power to veto laws, among others. Now, after the Constitution was written and as it was being debated, there was a debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Federalists believe in a strong federal government. Federal in this case means like the central government, whereas Anti-Federalists, not surprisingly, are against that. They believe more in states' rights. And so when we're taking notes here, they want a strong central government. They want strong leaders. And they focus on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, basically to say, well, the Articles of Confederation sucked. It couldn't do this, it couldn't do that. That's proof that we need a strong central government. And all of our famous names, Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, are all Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, they focus more on states' rights. They feared that a strong central government would infringe upon states' rights. And so they want to have a weaker, so they propose instead a weaker central government. The problem was they were poorly organized. Their leaders, well, at least today, aren't the more famously known American leaders. And so because they weren't as organized, they weren't able to keep up with what Hamilton and others were doing. He wrote the Federalist Papers, which were essays to defend the document to the public, if you remember that clip from Nonstop from Hamilton. So ultimately, the Constitution was ratified. And after it was ratified, they passed the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. First Amendment, freedom of speech, religion, protest. Second Amendment, right to bear arms. Third Amendment, you can't quarter troops. Fourth Amendment, right to a fair trial. Eighth Amendment, no cruel or unusual punishment. And the 10th Amendment says any rights not given to the federal government belonged to the states. All right, now we're getting to our first two presidents, George Washington and then John Adams. George Washington ruled from 1789 to 1797. So you'll see he was inaugurated a year and a half after the Constitution was ratified. And he was elected unanimously by the Electoral College. He was a revolutionary hero from the French and Indian War through the American Revolution. He chaired the Constitutional Convention, so he was a hero loved by both sides. And he helped to set the precedent in organizing the federal government. So some of the things that he did, and let me start to keep track of some of his achievements. First, in terms of economics. So this was headed by Alexander Hamilton, who was his Secretary of Treasury. First, he paid off the national debt. Not only did he pay off the national debt, but he had the national government assume states' debts, which means the national government would pay off the states' debts. That was to basically have a clean slate, to not owe anybody money. He also created a national bank, which would lead to kind of a more stable economy, more stable currency. And if you know Hamilton, Cabinet Battle number 1, I believe, is all about this argument or debate over the creation of a national bank. In terms of foreign affairs, there were some initial conflicts. This is during the time of the French Revolution. The French, remember, supported the Americans during our revolution. And so there were lots of discussions as to whether we should support our French allies. Ultimately, the US decided not to, because they were just barely getting on their feet. They didn't have the manpower or the strength or the stability to help someone else fight a war. And so they were officially neutral. So America was officially neutral. So it's called the Neutrality Proclamation. Now there were still conflicts. There was conflict with France over whether or not we would support them in the French Rev. There was conflict with the British, who were seizing American ships and taking our goods, which will lead to the War of 1812 later on. And then there were some conflicts with Spain as well over trade in Spanish America. So America is officially neutral, but there's still conflicts with France and England that we'll see continue to develop. And then in terms of domestic concerns, so foreign means abroad with other countries, domestic means within the United States. First, in terms of Washington's relations with Native Americans, he helped to gain quite a bit more land from the Native Americans. Whether you want to say that he stole it or negotiated for it is up to your perspective, I suppose. His biggest domestic concern probably, though, was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when basically some farmers refused to pay a whiskey tax. If you think about Hamilton, when Thomas Jefferson says at the end of Cabinet Battle number 1, just imagine what can happen when you try to tax our whiskey. He knew, or at least in the musical Hamilton, Jefferson knew that eventually these taxes were going to catch up to the federal government. And so these farmers in Pennsylvania refused to pay this whiskey tax. This was the first big challenge to the federal government, the first big challenge to Washington. And the question was basically, what are you going to do? 7 years earlier, during Shays' Rebellion, which was a similar farmers' rebellion refusing to pay taxes, the government did nothing. They were too weak to do anything under the Articles of Confederation. And so Washington knew we can't just sit back and lay down and let these people walk over us. We have to be tough. And so Washington responded with force. He sent 15,000 men to squash the rebellion. Now, there wasn't actually any conflict. The farmers stopped, they put down their arms, and they allowed the taxes to be collected. So there wasn't any major violence. But this was significant because Washington showed that he was going to enforce the law of the land. and that you have to follow the law of the land. You have to pay these taxes. And so he kind of set the precedent, if you will, that you have to pay taxes, and there will be a strong federal government that will enforce those taxes if you don't. I'll just say that there are new lands as well, plus 3 new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And then the last thing is the creation of political parties. I'm not going to add that to the notes yet because we'll get to it later. I'll just get to it later. When George Washington finally steps aside, he gives his famous farewell address. And again, we will listen to or hear some of this when we listen to One Last Time from Hamilton. In George Washington's farewell address, he offered some warnings to the American people. He said, first, we must stay neutral. Don't get involved in Europe's affairs. Don't make any permanent alliances. We have to stay neutral, take care of our own house. But he also knew that taking care of his own house also meant we shouldn't fight each other. Do not form political parties. If we have political parties, we're just going to butt heads against each other and there will be conflict. And don't fall into sectionalism. Sectionalism means one section or one region wants one thing, one section or one region wants another. We know he's going to fail because there's going to be a civil war 60 years later that's essentially fought over sectional or regional differences. So his farewell address offers some warnings, let's say. And he encourages people to avoid permanent alliances and foreign affairs, which we do an okay job of for at least a little while. But then he also says to avoid political parties and sectionalism or regional conflicts, which we will fail at quite a bit. Again, George Washington sets the precedent for how a president should rule. He sets a precedent for how much power the president and federal government has, which is a decent amount. I mean, he creates a national bank. He sets the precedent that we will enforce these laws. He was replaced by a much weaker president, John Adams, who's kind of the butt of many jokes if you watch Hamilton. John Adams was the president, Thomas Jefferson was his vice president, and John Adams was kind of mired in a whole bunch of conflicts. And most of those conflicts were over conflict with other political parties. So John Adams was a Federalist, and he oftentimes had conflict with the other political party, which were the Democratic Republicans. If you know Hamilton, you know that Jefferson and Madison and Aaron Burr, sort of, are Democratic Republicans. Adams has quite a few problems during his time as president. It wasn't quite as smooth sailing as under Washington. First, the XYZ affair. France was seizing some of our ships, and France basically said, well, if you give us some money, you know, we'll help you out. The XYZ affair almost brought us to war with France. But again, it was another one of those tests of whether or not we would actually stay neutral. There were also the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed to limit the power of the Democratic Republicans. And the Alien and Sedition Acts basically tried to strip citizenship away from people. It said in order to become a citizen, you have to have been here for 14 years rather than 5. The Alien Act said the president could deport any immigrant who was considered dangerous during time of war. This was an excuse for him to deport potentially his enemies, the Democratic Republicans. And the Sedition Act made it illegal for newspapers to criticize the president or Congress. We're going directly against the First Amendment, freedom of press. So the Alien Act gives the president power to deport dangerous immigrants. The Sedition Act gives makes it illegal for the press to criticize the president. And all of these, quite clearly, are the president kind of becoming tyrannical and abusing his powers, which is exactly what the colonists had been fighting against during the American Revolution. And so there was quite a debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Supreme Court hadn't officially established its right to judicial review to declare a law unconstitutional, so they couldn't do that yet. And so basically what happens is once the Democratic Republicans took over Congress, they just let the laws expire. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts were a first challenge, I guess, to American democracy. It was a first test to see if American democracy would stand strong through this threat to the people's power and people's freedoms. And at least for now, American democracy survived to a certain extent, I guess. John Adams only served one term. He lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. Again, John Adams is a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. There was a peaceful transfer of power. Election of 1800, Jefferson, who was a Democratic Republican, wins, and there is a peaceful transfer of power, sometimes called the Revolution of 1800, because, well, look at every other time there's been a transfer of power. French Revolution, a bunch of heads got chopped off. American Revolution, there was a massive war against England. So it was almost revolutionary to consider that you could transfer power from one group to another without violence, without conflict. This shouldn't be a debate, but as I'm recording this in 2020, Donald Trump is not guaranteeing a peaceful transfer of power if he loses the election in a month and a half. So we'll see, depending on when you're watching this, what happens. Okay, I want to add a little bit more detail in terms of who the Democratic Republicans are and who the Federalists are. Actually, no, I'll just do that when we get to chapter 7. So to show all of our notes here, we've got the Articles of Confederation and Constitution. And then we've got our first and second presidents.